I've had a lot of people asking me what Pope Francis is doing regarding the Latin Mass. Is he trying to get rid of it? Why does he dislike it? And I don't think that that gets at the heart of what it is that his Motu Proprio Traditionis Custodes is really trying to do. He released this document and an accompanying letter to his fellow bishops in July, and explaining the changes that were going to surround the Latin Mass and the reasons behind it. And of course, it catches fire, and because Pope Francis is perceived as a very liberal pope compared to some of his predecessors, a lot of conservative Catholic news outlets jumped on it immediately and began to be very concerned and say, well, why does he dislike the Latin Mass? Well, what's really going on here? To understand, we have to know the history. We have to know how this came about. After the Second Vatican Council, which attempted a very serious and important liturgical renewal, in 1970, Pope Paul VI promulgated the new Roman Missal that was published in languages around the world to allow people to celebrate Mass according to what was called the Novus Ordo, or the New Order, if you will. And in the past, when this has been done, and it has been done at various points in history when a liturgical renewal was needed in the Church, all of the previous missals, all of the previous rites of the Church were removed, were taken away from being used by the Church. But in this case, that was not so. The previous missal, the older Mass, was not removed from usage. So that meant that it could still be celebrated validly as an expression of the liturgy of the Church. And much of the reason for this at the time was the recognition that this change was rather drastic. It changed the official language of the liturgy from Latin to being spoken in the local language, whether that's English, French, Spanish, Chinese, whatever it might be. That's a big change. And there was a lot of change in order to try to simplify it, to remove some of the mystical symbolism that many people didn't get or understand. It was an attempt to make the Mass more accessible to people. I know that I've spoken with people who said that they remember the old rite of Mass and they didn't know what was going on. And now they do, because the Mass is in English. Even if the language is sometimes hard to follow, even if we don't always enter into every moment, it's at least possible to do so because it's in our own language. So that was a significant change, and at the time it was thought, well, this is a big enough change, maybe we should leave the old rite for those people who would have a hard time transitioning to something new, who want to maintain this heritage, to continue it, and eventually those people will die off as the generations continue and it will disappear. But that's not what happened. What began to happen was there was a lot of people who rediscovered this older form of worship, the Latin rite with all of its symbolism and its emphasis more on transcendence, on being taken up, that there's something bigger going on at Mass. And the Latin Mass captures that a little better than the Mass that we celebrate in most of our parishes on Sundays. People began to become attracted to that. And so rather than fading away, it maintained its usage. And people, especially today, a lot of young people, really enjoy and appreciate the Latin Mass. So it didn't happen as they had expected 50 years ago. But that becomes tricky because, well, is it the new or is it the old? So in 2007, Pope Benedict XVI wrote a Motu Proprio of his own, Summorum Pontificum, to declare that both of these expressions of the liturgy, both of these expressions of Mass, the Mass celebrated in the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass, were two parts of the same liturgy, and he called them the ordinary and the extraordinary form of the Mass. And in doing so, he was binding those two liturgies together, because there are other rites of Mass celebrated by different traditions. Ours is the Roman rite. We use the Roman Missal. There's a Byzantine Mass. There's a Melkite Mass. There's a Marianite Mass. And they're all in communion with the Pope and with the Catholic Church, but they come from a very different tradition. Pope Benedict was saying these both come from the same tradition, and they're two expressions of the same thing. And that was extremely important. The reason he was doing that is because there were groups who had split from the Catholic Church because they fundamentally disagreed with the changes in the liturgy, among other things. They challenged the validity of the Second Vatican Council, which in effect was splitting up the Church. And this has happened many times in history, and the Church is always trying to repair those splits. It's much easier for us as human beings to split apart than it is for us to pull ourselves back together and to reunite. And as Christians, we are called to be in unity with Christ, with one another. So as Catholics, that's a fundamental part of our goal and everything that we are about. Pope Benedict released this and said, okay, this is an olive branch to those groups who were challenging the Church's authority, challenging the Second Vatican Council, to say, look, your liturgy is a part of our heritage. The Latin Rite is a part of our heritage. We're going to incorporate that into our Church in a formal way. Now come back. Come back, please. We're doing everything that we can to try to make it easier for you to come back and rejoin the Church. And so in a very creative way, he creates this sort of union of these two very different styles of worship. And in the years following, the Latin Mass began to gain a lot of traction, but not always in a positive way. Because the people who are typically attracted to the Latin Mass tend to be more of your intellectuals, people who understand and know the faith more deeply, who are perhaps more interested in learning some of the Latin. And that's not for everyone. In fact, it's probably not for most people. But the people who became attracted to that became a certain type of person, typically younger, typically more intelligent, and those people were more attracted to the Latin Mass. And in time, that began to create groups. Now, we're human beings. We all belong to groups. There's always going to be cliques. There will always be some people who are in and some people who are out. But that's different when we're talking about liturgical things than when we're talking about social things. Right? There are different groups who like to gather and to spend time together, but the liturgy is about uniting each and every one of us and bringing us all together. And what began to happen is that you would have a parish who would have the Novus Ordo Mass in English or in the local language, and they would have an extraordinary form Mass in the Latin. And there was very little overlap. It was almost as though there were two different communities. One more traditional, one less traditional. And that became an issue in some places. And as time went on over the last 14 years, and the bishops reflected and Pope Francis reflected on this, if you read his letter, you can see how disappointed he is that he has to make this change in the Motu Proprio to restrict the Latin Mass. And what he does is he does not remove it. He does not abrogate it. He could have done that, but he did not do that. He said, no, it's going to be up to the local bishop. No longer can a priest make the decision. It has to be the bishop who allows a priest to celebrate the Latin Mass. He moves away from the ordinary, extraordinary language and says, no, there is one rite that is appropriate for us, and this ritual of the Latin Mass can be used still as a valid form of worship. But Pope Francis is once again responding to the need for unity, for the communities to be seeing it as the same thing. Pope Benedict, in his way, was attempting to say, these are two parts of the same thing. But for many people, that was not their lived reality. It was this or this, and some perceived this one as better and this is inferior. And that's not the case. That's not what Pope Benedict intended. That's not what the Fathers of Vatican II intended. That's not what the Church intended. And Pope Francis had to respond to that and say, okay, we need to unify. We need to connect these two splitting up things, because the liturgy needs to be about unity. St. Paul complained to the Corinthians that the reason they were gathering for a meal as a part of the Eucharistic celebration, and he said, now you're starting to split into rich and poor. That's not good. And so he changes how they're celebrating the Eucharist, the liturgy in Corinth. Pope Francis is doing much of the same. We need to make sure that we remember that the Latin Mass is just an extension or a familiar part of the Novus Ordo. It's not that one is better than the other. So that's the reason behind what Pope Francis is doing. And practically speaking, not much is changing, especially in our diocese. We have one Latin Mass. It is celebrated at Holy Family Church in Latrobe on Sundays at 1 p.m. And it is valid as your Sunday worship option. That has been the case. That will continue to be the case unless something changes. Unless Bishop Kulik decides for the sake of unity something needs to change. But it's not because he or Pope Francis dislike the Latin Mass. All of this is in the interest of holding the Church together so that we are one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, as we certainly believe when we pray the Creed every Sunday. God bless, and we'll see you next time.